Bertie and the Lion. Hello, this is Natasha, and I'm dropping by to tell you a story I just heard about Prince Bertie when he was a boy. It's all about how he had a very special pet called Tiddles. Tiddles was a cat. Well, actually, he was a bit more than that. He was a lion, and for a while he lived in the palace with Bertie. This is how I learned the story. I was walking along by the palace pond when I heard Tim the Tadpole's squeaky voice saying, "Bertie, can I have a puppy?" "Oh, please, Bertie. I would so love to have a pet to play with." Bertie was looking a bit stumped for a reply because he doesn't like to say no, but he can't always do what Tim wants. Even though he used to be a prince, he can't do everything. In fact, now that he's a frog, most things are more difficult than ever, except for hopping and catching flies with his tongue. But before Bertie could explain to Tim why it's tricky for a tadpole to keep a puppy, Colin the carp butted in.
"Oh dear, is there no end to the silly questions of little tadpoles? You can't have a pet that's bigger than yourself. If you had a Popeye, you would be the Popeye's pet or his breakfast."
"Oh, yes, you can have a pet that's bigger than yourself," said Bertie. "The Queen once had a camel, and that was even bigger than Her Majesty."
"Well, you can't have a pet that's big enough to eat you," said Colin. "And Tim wouldn't even make a slight snack for a Popeye. He would be like a little morsel on the end of his tongue."
"Oh, yes, you can have a pet that's big enough to eat you," said Bertie. "When I was a prince, I had a lion for a pet."
"Rubbish," said
Colin.
"You're just making up stories again."
"Well, I'm allowed to make up stories," said Bertie, "because that's what I'm best at. But this one happens to be true." And then Bertie told all the pond life the story of how he had a lion as a pet. I stopped to listen because it sounded jolly interesting. One time, when Bertie was a small princeling, he went with his mother to the pet shop. This all happened in the good old days before the wicked Queen took over and Bertie turned into a frog. Bertie's mother was much nicer, although a little bit eccentric, which meant that her ideas were sometimes out of the ordinary. She wanted to buy a camel because she thought it would look interesting roaming around the palace grounds. The shopkeeper considered himself to be a bit of a wit, so he said to the Queen, "Ah, yes, ma'am, a camel. Well, will that be one hump or two?" The Queen gave the shopkeeper one of her stares, as if she meant his head to be chopped off. So he stuttered, "Of course, ma'am, I do apologise. Right now we're out of camels, but we do have all sorts of interesting animals fresh in from Africa. For instance, we have a handsome lion cub, and a lion is rather more royal than a camel, if you don't mind me saying so." The Queen was about to say, "You silly little man, lions are for statues, not pets." But Prince Bertie had already run over to the cub's corner of the shop. He was so small, fluffy and cute And he also looked just a little bit sad to be living in a box. He gave Bertie a tiny little roar like "Roar." And so Bertie said, Mummy, do let's have a lion cub. I promise I'll look after him all by myself. Honest I will. I will keep him with me always and we will be the bestest of friends. Bertie's mother sometimes seemed a bit fierce, but she was a big softie really, and she thought that the lion cub looked very cute and harmless too. So she gave the shopkeeper a gold coin, and they took the cub home to the palace. Bertie called him Tiddles, because he thought that was a very funny name for a lion. The Queen said that it was all right for friends to call him Tiddles, but that he would have to have an official name too for special occasions. So she said that his proper name would be Leopold the First. Leopold the First, or Tiddles as everybody called him, loved living in the palace. At night he slept in Bertie's bed, where he looked just like a fluffy lion toy. During the day he liked sitting on the roof and watching everyone come and go. Up there he looked just like a statue of a lion, until he started to move and prowl among the battlements, which gave everyone who noticed a big surprise. At other times he went for walks around the palace grounds, and everyone agreed that he was far more interesting and royal than a camel would ever have been. For breakfast, Tiddles ate raw steak. For lunch, he ate raw steak, and for supper, he ate raw steak. And Tiddles grew, and he grew, and he became quite big. But however big he became, he still loved Bertie. When he saw Bertie coming home from school, he would leap off the roof of the palace into the branches of the big oak tree. Then he would climb down and bound up the drive to greet Bertie. He would jump up and hug him with his paws and lick his face. And then they would run into the grounds and play soccer together. Tiddles was great at dribbling the ball with his nose. Though one day, when he was hungry, he ate Bertie's best football boots. But Bertie didn't mind because he loved Tiddles so very much. Another game they liked playing was frightening the royal nanny. Tiddles and Bertie would both hide behind the curtains, and when they heard her coming along calling, "Bertie, it's way past your bedtime, young prince," they would both leap out and roar like this. Roar! And she would be so frightened that she would run off to her room, and Bertie and Tiddles could stay up for another half an hour to play. But one day the king said to Bertie over breakfast, "That cub of yours has become quite a lion. He's already growing a mane. It's time he went to the zoo." "The zoo? You can't put Tiddles behind bars. And besides, I love him. You should think of my feelings too, Daddy." Of course, the king didn't want to make Bertie sad, so he agreed that Tiddles could live in the palace a little longer. But then one day Tiddles did something that made the king very cross indeed. He had just appointed a new Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and all the grandest and most important people in the land came to see the king in the palace. And Tiddles was waiting for them. By now Tiddles was quite a grown-up lion, and he was no longer a cub. By the standard of cats, he was big. Well, actually, he was huge. And if you didn't know him, you would be quite scared to meet him. In fact, you would be terrified. A big velvet curtain hung behind the throne, and sometimes Tiddles liked to sleep behind it. It was his hideaway place. When the new ministers trooped into the throne room to meet the king, 3 musicians sounded their trumpets. The sound woke up Tiddles, and he thought there would be a party with lots of music and games. So he strolled out from behind the curtains, stretched his body, and then turned round to lick his bottom. In actual fact, he didn't do anything very frightening at all. But the ministers were frightened. The Minister of War climbed out of the window and jumped into a rose bush where he tore his trousers on the thorns. The Prime Minister had more mettle than that, and he picked up a chair and he held it out in front of himself like a lion tamer. Tiddles yawned and showed all his teeth. That was too much. The whole government, including the Prime Minister, leapt out of the windows. The king was furious because they trampled all over his roses. He decided that he didn't like the government after all, so he sacked the lot of them and appointed some new ministers. The next day, the newspaper headlines ran like this: King throws ministers to the lions, and lion taming Prime Minister gets the sack. The king was furious when he read the papers, and he resolved that Tiddles must go immediately. The new Prime Minister, who would replace the old one who would run away from Tiddles, said he thought the best place for a lion would be in Africa. In fact, everyone in the palace who loved Tiddles, and that was everyone except for the royal nanny, all agreed that it would be a wonderful thing to set him free in the wild where he could live the life of a real lion. And so that's what happened. The Minister of Nature put Tiddles on a flight to Africa. Before the plane left the tarmac, Prince Bertie came on board to give his pet a special goodbye hug. Then the plane flew Tiddles to Tanzania in East Africa. First, he lived in a special sanctuary for lions. Then they released him into the wild. Bertie knew that things had turned out as they should, though he was very sad that he would never see his best friend again. 3 years later, the royal family chose a very special holiday. They went on safari in East Africa. They travelled across the open bush in 4-wheel drive cars and saw all the wild animals. They had guides who carried guns just in case any creatures decided to attack them. At night, they slept in tents under the stars. One night, they slept on the edge of the Ngorongoro crater. The king and queen decided to rest for the next day before continuing their safari. Bertie had become friendly with the chief guide, whose name was Joshua. He asked Joshua if he had ever heard of a lion who had lived in the palace and had been released into the wild. And to Bertie's surprise, Joshua said that of course everyone who worked in the game reserve had heard the story of the royal lion called Tiddles. Now he was a big, strong, grown-up lion and was the leader of his pride, which is like a group of lions. He agreed to take Bertie the next morning to see Tiddles come down to his favourite watering hole. But he made Bertie promise to stay in the car because Tiddles was a wild lion now and might be dangerous. So Bertie got up at 5 a.m. rosy red clouds still veiled the fierce African sun, so that the air was still lovely and fresh. The great Ngorongoro crater was filled with mists, so it looked like a witch's cauldron. Then the treetops started to emerge from the swirling brew. They got into the car and slowly drove down the winding route into the base of the crater. By now the sunlight was starting to play on the bark of the acacia trees. Zebra and deer were grazing in the long grass, always watching with their big glassy eyes for any suspicious movement. There could be a big cat hunting for its breakfast. Eventually they came to the watering hole, where Joshua said that Tiddles liked to come and drink sometimes. He didn't come here every day, so they would need to be lucky. And so they waited. And Bertie saw lots of beautiful pink flamingos. And he saw a hippo give the biggest yawn he had ever seen. And eventually the grass began to move, and a big lion followed by 3 lionesses began to gambol down by the water. Although he was much bigger than when he had last seen him, Bertie knew right away that it was Tiddles. But Tiddles took no notice of the car. He was used to tourists and didn't think to see who was inside. Instead, he led his pride down to drink. Bertie wound down the window and called out, "Tiddles!" But still Tiddles didn't hear him. So then Bertie did something very silly indeed. He forgot about Joshua's warning, and he opened the door of the car and jumped out onto the ground. He started walking towards Tiddles. Joshua immediately leapt out of the driver's seat and trained his gun on Tiddles. "Your Royal Highness," he said, "you'd better get back into the car. Just come back slowly. Don't run. If you run, they will attack you." But Bertie carried on walking towards the lions and called out, "Tiddles! Tiddles! Don't you remember me? I'm Bertie, your best friend." Tiddles took his mouth up from the water and looked round at Bertie. He stared at him for about half a minute, and then he started to bound towards him with a great cat-like spring in his step. Joshua squeezed his trigger, but his gun didn't fire. Dust, blown up from the wheels of the car, had got into the gun and jammed it. It all happened so fast. Bertie didn't have time to be afraid or to regret not taking Joshua's advice. Tiddles' feet took off from the ground. He flew towards Bertie, wrapped his paws around him, and licked his face. Then Bertie and Tiddles did a kind of a dance around the acacia trees. The friends were reunited and overjoyed to see each other once again. And that's the story of how Bertie had a pet lion, set him free in the wild African bush, and then went out to meet him again. Bertie says that if you are ever near a wild animal, you must be ever so careful and follow all instructions that you are given. Wild animals are very beautiful, but also very dangerous. And don't forget, there are loads more stories at storynori.com. We have stories about Bertie, both when he was a prince and now that he's a frog. We have other original stories about Theo the monkey, Katie the witch, and Gladys the songwriter. And we also have loads of traditional fairy tales, myths and legends. So drop by soon and listen to another one. For now, from me, Natasha, bye-bye.